Hi everyone, it's John. As I've been promising off and on for months now, I am ready to show everyone my last installment of books I bought several months ago from Princeton. So, unlike the first three sets that I showed everyone, I pulled up the sort of advertising matter for each book and read it aloud. Those videos ended up being 35 and 40 and 45 minutes long. I just have 10 books to show you, so I kind of want to get this done in more like 15 or 20 minutes and not have to waste as much of your time. There's just 10 books here, so it shouldn't end up taking me 40 minutes, really. So if you're interested in the kind of books that you've seen in past Princeton University Press installments, the last three, or the books that I usually show on this channel, go ahead and grab a pencil and a piece of paper. And I think there's some really good stuff here. If you're interested in any of it, or end up buying any of it, or are interested in me giving any of them sort of priority reviews, let me know. Leave a comment in the box, as always, and I will respond. First up, some history of science. Here is A Well-Ordered Thing, Dmitri Mendeleev and the Shadow of the Periodic Table by Michael D. Gordon. So this obviously, the subtitle tells you a lot of what the book is going to be about, but apparently it's sort of a biography of Mendeleev, who, if you're not familiar, was the person who, if you ever took a Chem 101 class in high school or college, he's the one who organized many of the elements into a sort of, periodic table. That's why we call it that. And of course, he didn't have all the elements at the time. He just had a very sort of scarce, sketchy outline of elements, but he saw trends and how they were developing, and he could predict the next elements that were going to be found based on their characteristics and how they would act with other elements. But apparently, and I didn't know any of this, he had a fascinating life. He took this voyage to the Arctic Circle, and he also tried to fly around in this hot air balloon trip. I I don't know where that was or how long it lasted or how successful it was, but apparently he led a pretty interesting life above and beyond the periodic table as well. He lived in a very interesting time in Russia, of course, the latter 19th century. So I look forward to this. Next up is this, how inequality and faith made the medieval church. Trustworthy men. How inequality and faith made the medieval church, by Ian Forrest. This is sort of a history of the English church from the 13th through the 16th centuries, and talks about how the church operated through social bonds of trust and, inequality too, and faith in performing what the church needed to perform. It says on the inside cover that the church, I'd never heard this term before, the church used trustworthy men, in Latin, viri fidedigni, who were jurors, informants, and witnesses who represented their parishes when bishops needed local knowledge or reliable collaborators. So they sort of used them as covert, people to gather information in the community, which is sort of weird. But church history, English church history, medieval. This book is Pagans, andPhilosophers, which I noticed that Peg over at the History Shelf also picked up. The Problem of Paganism from Augustine to Leibniz by John Marenbaum. John Marenbaum is probably, one of the 3, 4, 5 greatest living scholars of medieval theology today, medieval philosophy today. He teaches somewhere in England, I believe. Of course, the problem with paganism is, to the extent that there was one when philosophers were mostly Christian, was that in the days of Aristotle and Plato, and for a long time afterwards, and for a bit before, none of them were Christian, because Christ, of course, came afterwards. But, once you hit around the time of Boethius, until, say, the 17th or 18th century, almost every single major Western philosopher is a Christian. With a few exceptions, like, Spinoza wasn't a Christian, but most of them were. And you sort of get this problem. How did the ancients have such profound civilization knowledge of philosophy, science, art, but they didn't have the Christian God? So that kind of is a problem if you're a philosopher, maybe. So I'm thinking that's what the book sort of explores, maybe a bit more subtly than I put it, but... Next up, this is one of the fascinating things Princeton has is several whole series of reintroduced total works, collected works by one person. And this is just one volume of the dozens and dozens and dozens of works by Jung that they have, the psychiatrist, psychologist, Carl Jung. These are the lectures that he delivered at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich from 1933 to 1934. And it basically gives a brief history, it is quite brief, a brief history of psychology from its very, very, very early incarnations. We're talking like 18th century. So before we think of what psychology properly is today, I mean, he goes back, I think he might even sort of pick up at the Renaissance a little bit. But he basically gives a firm historical footing and context for the birth of psychology. So some history of psychology lectures by Jung. Next. Really nice, heavy book. Unfabling the East, The Enlightenment's Encounter with Asia by, I don't know if you can see that, it's Jürgen Osterhammel. This is apparently a recounting and sort of retelling of several voyages that Westerners, Europeans, took to the East. How they saw the East, how they talked about it in science and art, what they came back with, what they thought was important, how they interacted with the East generally. Among the people who took a keen interest in Asian culture and history, it says here are Hegel, of course, in his philosophy of history. He talks a lot about Eastern history, but also Gibbon, Voltaire, and Leibniz. So three of those distinctly of the Enlightenment. Hegel probably post-Enlightenment a little bit, but depending on where you want to draw the lines. But yeah, sort of the East seen through the West's eyes in the 17th and maybe early 19th, 18th and early 19th centuries. This is a critical biography, and I'm not just saying that because that's actually the subtitle of the book. This is Early Auden, Later Auden, a critical biography by Edward Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn without the H. This was published as 2 volumes, actually. One in the early 80s, one in the early 90s. And they offer a volume where you get it sort of just as a 1-volume form. Comes in at about 900 pages. So I think, as far as I know, this is still, despite the first volume being 40 years old and the second volume being 30 years old, is still one of the best standing biographies of Auden that's ever been written. If anyone knows more about that than I do, and if you know anything, you probably know more than I do, then leave a note below in case there's a more important or interesting biography than this. But if anything, it certainly seems comprehensive. So, all right, 12 minutes, not so bad. I have recently purchased a book by this woman. She has at least one book available through the Liberty Fund, which I've mentioned several times on this channel. And one of those books is her sort of history and opinion of the French Revolution. And the woman is Germaine de Staël. And this is called Germaine de Staël, A Political Portrait, by Bianca Maria Fontana. Fontana teaches in Switzerland at the University of Lausanne. And she's published a couple of other things with Princeton. This is a short biography of her that puts her sort of in her own time and historical context. A fascinating woman, by the way. A woman novelist. Writing more than 200 years ago, quite rare. But also a literary critic. Came from a fabulously wealthy family. In fact, I reviewed a book by Germaine de Staël's father on this channel. It's a book on the time that he spent directly after his time as the Director General for the French National Treasury under Louis XVI. Her father's name was Jacques Necker, and he was Louis XVI's basically head of the Treasury. Right, made some really controversial decisions during his tenure at the Treasury, including making the public budget, making the budget for the empire public for the first time, I think, in the 1780s. Very, very, very controversial decision on his part. But this is his daughter. Her mother, Germaine de Staël's mother, was a very, very famous and accomplished salonière. Ran her own salon in Paris, I believe, where she knew the most eminent, bright people of the day. So, her father was a banker, a tremendously successful Swiss banker. So she, even if she had never written a word on her own, would have been tremendously wealthy. And but the book goes into her political opinions later in life, her her opinions of the French Revolution, and later on how she sort of comes to loggerheads with Napoleon, and almost gets in some serious trouble for it. So, 2 more biographies, I guess. Didn't realize there was so much biography. I don't have really too much to say about this because I know a lot less about this person than I do of anyone else I've told you about, with perhaps the exception of the next person I'm going to tell you about, which is why I read books on them, right? This is Pericles of Athens by Vincent Azoulay. And this is looks to be a pretty well-documented, I was going to say scholarly, but then it comes out from Princeton University Press, so you would expect no less, right? Just sort of explanation of at what I guess 5th century Athens. Pericles is 5th century BC. So, sort of Golden Age Athens, Golden Age democratic Athens. Another tremendously, hopefully thorough biography. I would like to read this ideally in conjunction with, and at the same time as the essays. Montaigne, A Life by Philippe Descamps. The book apparently goes into, needless to say, Montaigne's life, but also his heavy interest in politics. And Descamps tries to argue that it's only after Montaigne basically considered himself a political failure, he had given up, that he really had the fullness of time in which to devote himself to the composition of the essays. I knew that he was sort of a diplomat and a political actor, but didn't know nearly as much about his life, and I'm interested in more than a Wikipedia entry. So I guess the only middle ground is picking up an 800-page biography. Okay, and this last book is one that Peg and I are going to read, right? Because we agreed on it. I don't know if we didn't do the blood oath or anything, no omerta, but I think we have agreed to read this in October, right? Did we pick the date too? I don't know. If anyone wants to join in, you still have some time. I think this is Peter Brown's latest big book, not including sort of essays or anything like that. This is Peter Brown, Through the Eye of a Needle, Wealth, the Fall of Rome, and the Making of Christianity in the West, 350 to 550 AD. So if you know Peter Brown from anywhere, you probably know him as being one of the most eminent scholars of antiquity alive today. And you probably know him for a book. If you do know him for a book, it's for his biography of Augustine of Hippo, which came out, I think, in 1968 or 1969. And Peter Brown is still around and still writing fabulous, amazing, scholarly books. And I think Peg and I have agreed on this one. There's still, 6 or 7 weeks before October gets here. So if you were also interested in this, Peg and I are more than open to having other readers along with us. So go ahead and hit up Princeton, or if you have a well-stocked one, your local library, and get a copy of this and read this with us, maybe. Okay, so 20 minutes, not bad. Much better than 40. Those are the last of my Princeton books, and next week I will see you again with another book review. Bye.